The walls of Westbrook Academy were lined with polished mahogany, and its stone pathways led to a sprawling campus nestled in the heart of a wealthy suburban neighborhood. To the outside world, Westbrook was the epitome of academic excellence. Its students were expected to not only excel in their studies, but also to embody the kind of polished, almost aristocratic charm that would secure them top spots in Ivy League schools. The school was known for its elite reputation, one that was untouchable, often boasting about its impeccable record in academics, arts, and athletics. Parents who could afford it pushed for their children to be admitted, seeing it as a stepping stone to a successful future. Yet, despite the pristine image it presented, the school had an undercurrent of elitism that created a culture of division, one that was hard for outsiders to penetrate. This wasn't just a school. It was a world of privilege, and it was the kind of world that didn't welcome anyone who didn't fit into its mold. This is where Tyrell found himself, an ambitious 15-year-old black boy who had always dreamed of making music his life, now thrust into a horrible world that felt foreign and uncomfortable. The school was a constant reminder that not everyone was welcomed equally. Tyrell had known this from the moment he walked through the gates on his first day. As he passed by groups of students laughing and chatting, the whispers about the scholarship kid never seemed to stop. Can you believe they let someone like him in here? Tyrell overheard two girls giggling as he walked by them. They didn't even know him, but the cold stares were enough to make him feel invisible. They all assumed that someone like him wouldn't belong at an institution like this. Tyrell had always known that fitting in here would be a challenge, but music was his escape. It was his passion, and nothing, not even the constant judgment of his classmates, could take that away from him. Tyrell's journey to Westbrook hadn't been easy. He had grown up in a modest apartment complex on the outskirts of town, where the streets were often filled with the sounds of sirens and shouting. His mother, a single parent, worked multiple jobs to support him and his younger sister. Music was the one thing that brought them peace amidst the chaos. Tyrell's mother, despite her long hours at work, made sure he had a piano practice on, even if it meant cutting back on something else. She believed in his talent, even when the world around him didn't. Tyrell, you've got a gift, baby. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. His mother's voice echoed in his memory as he sat in the practice room at school, staring at the piano keys. The sound of those encouraging words was the only thing keeping him going in this hostile environment. Tyrell had a gift, no doubt. He could play Beethoven, Chopin, and even the latest jazz compositions with a passion that made people listen, really listen. But there was one person who couldn't care less about that, Ms. Lawrence, the music teacher. Ms. Lawrence was a fixture at Westbrook Academy, her sharp, icy blue eyes scanning the room as she evaluated every student performance with a critical gaze. She was known for her perfectionist standards. Anyone who didn't meet those standards was seen as unworthy of her time. In fact, Ms. Lawrence had a reputation for being less than warm towards students who came from backgrounds that didn't align with the school's elite atmosphere. She believed music was for the privileged, those with years of formal training and access to the best resources. She couldn't understand how anyone could possess talent without having the right pedigree. "We'll see how well you do, Tyrell," she had said to him the first day he played in her class. The tone wasn't encouraging, but rather, it was laced with a subtle sneer, as if she already had doubts about his ability to play at the level expected in the prestigious environment of Westbrook. Tyrell could feel the condescension in her voice the moment she spoke to him. It wasn't the typical get-better critique that you'd hear from a teacher trying to encourage growth. No, it was a judgmental dismissal, like she'd already decided his chances before he even had a chance to prove himself. "You might want to rethink that piece, Tyrell," Ms. Lawrence had said one afternoon, observing his practice session. "It's clear you don't have the training to handle something so advanced. You don't come from the kind of background where classical music is really appreciated. Maybe you should stick to simpler pieces." Her words stung, and Tyrell's fingers froze above the keys. He couldn't believe she was saying this to him. Did she even care to know his story? Or was he just another kid she deemed unworthy of her time? He didn't know how to respond. So he simply kept playing, knowing that his talent would eventually speak louder than any harsh judgment she could throw at him. Tyrell's experience at Westbrook Academy was like a constant battle to prove his worth, not just others, but to himself. He was determined to show Ms. Lawrence and everyone else that his background didn't define his ability to play, to dream, to rise above. And every time he sat down at the piano, he did so not only to escape the hurt, but to take one more step toward proving them all wrong. Tyrell walked to the grand oak doors of Westbrook Academy with a nervous but hopeful energy in his chest. It was his first day in music class, the one subject he had always excelled in. Music was his escape, his language, his passion. And this was his chance to prove that he belonged at Westbrook, no matter what anyone else thought. He could feel the eyes of the students as they passed in the hall, their gazes lingering a little too long, their whispers just a tad too loud. Tyrell had grown used to it over the past few days. Being the only black student in a sea of predominantly white faces in his grade was something he couldn't ignore. But today, music was his refuge. When he stepped into the music room, it felt like the world outside faded for a moment. The large grand piano at the front of the room beckoned him. It was a beautiful instrument, polished and pristine, the kind of piano most students only dreamed of touching. Tyrell felt a thrill run through him just at the thought of playing on it. The room was filled with a mix of students. Some of them were already seated at smaller pianos. Others were talking among themselves, but a few stood out. Jenna, a popular and wealthy girl, was at the front of the room, her glossy hair cascading down her back as she whispered to her friends, laughing at something Tyrell couldn't hear. Her gaze met his for a brief second, and the smirk that crossed her face told him everything he needed to know. She was one of the ones who didn't think he belonged here. Tyrell ignored her, choosing to sit quietly at one of the side pianos. He wasn't here to make friends or fit in. He was here to play. He adjusted his seat, rolled his shoulders to shake off the tension, and started to focus on the sound of the keys beneath his fingers. For a moment, the sound of the other students faded as he lost himself in the music. This was where he felt most himself. No judgment, no expectations. Just music. Ms. Lawrence walked into the room, and instantly, the students fell silent. She was a sharp, older woman with a no-nonsense attitude that seemed to command respect, even fear. Her ice-cold blue eyes scanned the room as she made her way to the front, a look of barely concealed superiority on her face. She wore a tailored black dress and thick, rectangular glasses that gave her a constant air of judgment. Tyrell sat a little straighter, his heart pounding in his chest. This was the moment he would finally get to show everyone why he belonged here. But as Ms. Lawrence began her roll call, she barely acknowledged him. It was subtle, but it was there. When she called his name, her eyes didn't meet his. She simply marked the attendance with a quick flick of her pen. It wasn't the kind of attention a student typically craved, but in a room where everyone was expected to be perfect, Tyrell felt the sting of being invisible. As the class began, Ms. Lawrence walked around the room, making her way from one student to another. She paused at Jenna's piano, nodding approvingly at the flawless execution of a piece. Tyrell glanced up, but she didn't even acknowledge his presence. She seemed to deliberately avoid him, moving on to another student with a polite nod. It wasn't long before Ms. Lawrence called on the students to practice scales. Tyrell's fingers hovered over the keys as he prepared to begin. He had been practicing diligently at home, determined not to let the nerves get the best of him. But as he began to play, his fingers stumbled slightly over a wrong note. It wasn't a major mistake, but it was enough for Ms. Lawrence to notice. Without hesitation, she turned toward him, her eyes narrowing in a disapproving gaze. "Tyrell, perhaps you should stick to something simpler. You seem to have trouble with the basics." The words hit Tyrell harder than he expected. He had played that scale 1,000 times before, but the pressure of performing in front of his peers made his nerves get the best of him. He tried to play through it, but Ms. Lawrence wasn't finished. "You know, not everyone appreciates the finer things in life. Some people come from backgrounds where classical music is, well, foreign." Her voice was laced with condescension. "Maybe if you spend more time listening to music that actually matters, you'd understand this better." The room fell eerily silent. Tyrell's heart sank as he felt the weight of her words. Jenna and her friends exchanged glances, and he could hear the snickers starting from the corner of the room. He didn't need to turn around and know that they were laughing at him. "Yeah, right, Tyrell. Maybe you should just stick to hip-hop or something." Jenna's voice floated through the air, her words wrapped in thinly veiled mockery. Tyrell's fingers froze over the keys. He wanted to say something, to fight back, but the words wouldn't come. The humiliation was suffocating, and all he could do was lower his head and focus on the piano. Was this how it was going to be? No matter how much he practiced, how much effort he put into his craft, it would never be enough for them. He wasn't like the other students here. He wasn't from their world, and they made sure he knew it. The tension between Tyrell's love for music and his teacher's bias. As the class continued, Tyrell's heart wasn't in the music anymore. The room, once a place of escape, had become a battlefield. He was surrounded by judgment, from Ms. Lawrence's dismissive tone to the cruel laughter of the students. Music no longer felt like a refuge. It was a weapon they could use against him to remind him that he didn't belong. He glanced up at Ms. Lawrence, who was now moving on to another student, praising their flawless performance with her signature cold approval. She had dismissed him without a second thought, not caring to understand the barriers he had faced to even be in this room. But Tyrell wasn't done. No matter how much they tried to push him out, he wasn't going to let them take away his love for music. He had worked too hard for this. The weight of their judgment only made his resolve stronger. He would prove them wrong. He would play louder than their whispers, and when the day came, they'd see that his passion for music was something they could never understand. For now, though, he kept his head down, focused on the piano, and reminded himself this was just the beginning. The air in the music room was thick with expectation as Ms. Lawrence announced, "Today, we'll have a little demonstration of your skills. I want each of you to come up and play a piece of your choice." She had a way of speaking that made it sound like a privilege, when in reality, it felt more like a public test. The students started to stir in their seats, eagerly glancing at one another, most of them confident in their abilities, already planning which piece they would perform. Tyrell's heart skipped a beat. He had been preparing for this moment. It wasn't just a test. It was his chance to show them what he could do, to prove to everyone, including Ms. Lawrence, that he deserved to be there. But as the students took their turns, he noticed something unsettling. Ms. Lawrence wasn't as kind to him as she was to the others. Her gaze lingered for a moment on him before she turned her attention to Jenna, who had already raised her hand. "Jenna, please," Ms. Lawrence said with a smile, her tone sweet, almost overly so. Jenna moved to the piano with a flick of her hair, her fingers gracefully running over the keys as she played a complex, fast-paced piece. The class applauded, and Ms. Lawrence beamed at her, praising her flawless performance. Tyrell had been practicing for this moment for weeks. He had picked out a simple but beautiful piece, a melody that wasn't too flashy but showed his technical ability. As Jenna sat back down, Ms. Lawrence's eyes finally landed on him. "Ah, Tyrell," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You're up next. How fortunate." She smiled as she gestured toward the piano. "I'm sure this will be a treat for us all." Tyrell's chest tightened as he stood up. His mind raced, but his legs felt like lead. He had practiced tirelessly, and the idea of being dismissed by Ms. Lawrence, of being humiliated, was more than he could bear. But he had come this far, and he wasn't going to let her make him feel small. Not today. He walked the piano, trying to steady his breath, but the weight of the entire room's attention pressed down on him. He could feel the students' gazes, cold, uninterested, or worse, eager for him to fail. Especially Jenna, who was smirking at him from the corner of the room. "Go ahead, Tyrell," Ms. Lawrence said, her voice oozing with sarcasm. "Show us what you've got." Tyrell sat at the piano, his fingers hovering over the keys. The simple tune he had chosen was something he knew would be well received in a different setting, a beautiful classical piece that he could play effortlessly. But the moment he began, he felt as though the sound was distorted by the weight of judgment in the room. His fingers stumbled on a few notes, and the smooth flow of the melody was broken by his nerves. The more he tried to focus, the more the sneers and whispers in the background seemed to seep into his mind. From the corner of his eye, he saw Jenna exchange a glance with one of her friends, and the snicker that followed made his stomach churn. "Is that all?" Ms. Lawrence's voice cut through the room like a blade. "I thought we were in an advanced class. Tyrell, what was that supposed to be? A lullaby? This is hardly the kind of music that deserves attention." Tyrell felt his face flush. He had worked so hard to play something that would show his skill, but now it felt as though everything was falling apart. Ms. Lawrence's words were like a punch to the gut. She wasn't even trying to hide her disdain. The way she spoke to him, like he was beneath her, was suffocating. But Jenna wasn't done. Maybe if he spent less time pretending to be a pianist, he could actually learn how to play something decent. The words cut deeper than Tyrell wanted to admit. He knew what she meant. He wasn't like them. He didn't have the privilege of classical training from an early age. He hadn't been born into a world where playing the piano was just a part of life. For him, it was a passion, a dream, and yet here they were mocking him for it. "Enough, Jenna," Ms. Lawrence said, though her tone was far from stern. "Tyrell, perhaps you should choose something else. Something a bit more fitting for your level." Tyrell's hands shook as he stood up, barely able to control the overwhelming sense of embarrassment that threatened to overtake him. He tried to walk back to his seat, but Ms. Lawrence's voice stopped him. "Hold on, Tyrell," she said, her words laced with challenge. "I have an idea." Her cold eyes gleamed as she turned toward the piano. "Let's see if you can handle something a bit more demanding, a true test of your skills. How about Beethoven's Sonata No. 8 in C minor?" The room went quiet. Tyrell's stomach dropped. Beethoven? The Moonlight Sonata was one of the most difficult pieces of classical music, and Ms. Lawrence knew he didn't have the training for something like that. She wanted to watch him fail. She was daring him to try, fully expecting him to crumble under the pressure. Tyrell's mind raced. He could already hear the judgment, the mocking laughter that would follow if he failed. But then a part of him, the part that had always dreamed of rising above, stirred inside him. He swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. "I'll play it." The class seemed to hold its breath, waiting for him to make a mistake. Tyrell felt the weight of their gaze like 1,000 pounds pressing down on him. But something inside him refused to back down. He could already hear his mother's voice in his head. "Don't let them make you feel less than you are." He sat back down at the piano, his hands trembling, but determination rising in his chest. He could do this. Even if he stumbled, even if he didn't play it perfectly, he was going to give everything he had to show them that he wasn't some mistake, some charity case. He took a deep breath, and then his fingers hit the keys. The first few notes were shaky, but he didn't stop. He focused, blocked out the snickers, the cold eyes watching his every move. The music swirled around him like a storm, and for the first time since he'd walked into this room, he felt the familiar warmth of confidence ignite inside him. His hands, though nervous, found their rhythm. The room was silent as the notes filled the air, each one stronger than the last. Tyrell didn't know if he was playing it perfectly, but he didn't care. He played with the kind of passion he hadn't felt in weeks, not for them, but for himself. Ms. Lawrence watched, her expression unreadable, as Tyrell's fingers flew over the keys, his body leaning into the music. When he finished, the room was still. There were no cheers, no applause, just the silent hum of the air conditioner and the occasional call from a student too afraid to speak up. Tyrell's chest heaved with the effort, and for a second, he thought the silence might consume him. But then, slowly, Jenna's voice broke through the quiet. "Not bad, I guess." The words weren't much, but they were enough. Enough to tell him that maybe, just maybe, he had earned a little bit of respect, even if it was from the most unlikely of sources. Ms. Lawrence stood up slowly, a cold smile forming on her lips. "Well, I must admit, that wasn't completely awful, Tyrell." Her words were as sharp as ever, but to Tyrell, it felt like a victory. This wasn't the end. He had just begun to prove that he could overcome whatever obstacles came his way. Tyrell sat down at the piano, his fingers trembling as they hovered over the keys. The grand room, once filled with whispering and muttered remarks, had suddenly fallen into a heavy silence. Every eye was on him. The expectation in the air was so thick that he could almost taste it. This was it, the moment that would either make or break him. He closed his eyes for just a second, letting the cold air of the room settle around him. His hands felt clammy, but the more he focused on the keys, the more his mind began to clear. He wasn't just playing for them. He wasn't playing for Ms. Lawrence or Jenna or anyone else in the room. He was playing for himself. The Moonlight Sonata had always been a piece that spoke to him. The soft, melancholic rhythm, the way it built into something more intense, more powerful. It was everything he felt inside. Music had always been a way for him to express the things words couldn't touch, his dreams, his frustrations, his fears. Taking a deep breath, he placed his fingers on the keys. The soft, almost imperceptible sound of the first notes echoed in the room. For a moment, everything else faded. The mocking glances, the tense atmosphere. The only thing that mattered was the music, the piece that had become a part of him. The first few notes were shaky, just like his nerves, and for a brief moment, Tyrell felt a sense of panic surge through him. But he refused to let it control him. He drew in another steadying breath and focused. No more mistakes. The room was watching, waiting for him to fail. But with each note, his fingers found their rhythm. The melody, soft and sorrowful, began to take shape. His hands, now steady, moved more confidently. Each note carried more emotion, a deeper layer of feeling, as if the music was becoming his own story, woven into the delicate chords. The quiet, introspective beginning of the sonata reflected his inner turmoil, his struggle to be accepted, his need to prove that he could stand tall despite the odds. The melody grew, winding its way through the sorrowful lull of the opening section, slowly shifting toward a more dramatic and urgent theme. The music seemed to swirl around Tyrell, drawing him deeper into its embrace, lifting him. The notes weren't just sounds anymore. They were feelings, tension, release, a kind of emotional truth that only music could speak. Ms. Lawrence, who had been watching with a thinly veiled skepticism, was beginning to shift in her seat. At first, she seemed to remain distant, cold. But as Tyrell's playing became more assured, her expression slowly changed. Her lips parted slightly, her eyebrows furrowing as if she were trying to understand what was happening. She hadn't expected this. The other students, too, were slowly becoming silent, their attention drawn away from their phones and side conversations. They were listening now, really listening. Tyrell pushed on, lost in the music. The tempo quickened as he reached the stormier part of the sonata, the notes crashing into the air like waves. His fingers flew over the keys with a grace he hadn't known he possessed. This was the moment, the one where he would not back down. He could feel the music building, pushing him forward, urging him to let go of the fear and embrace the passion he had kept bottled up for so long. His fingers moved with an intensity, a purpose. He wasn't just playing anymore. He was living in the music. And in that moment, the room seemed to fade. There was only the sound of the keys, the perfect harmony of each note, the surge of emotion that surged through him. The audience, once full of skepticism, was now caught in the grip of his performance. Jenna, who had been the loudest to mock him, now sat frozen, her mouth slightly agape as she listened. She looked at him, really looked at him, and something shifted in her eyes. The arrogance that had once defined her was now gone, replaced by something close to awe. Ms. Lawrence, too, had stopped scribbling notes on her pad. Her eyes were wide as she observed Tyrell, her hands unconsciously folding together in front of her. She was no longer just watching him play. She was listening. Her usual sharpness, the cold, indifferent edge to her gaze, had softened. It was clear that she was stunned. The stormy crescendo of the piece began to subside, and Tyrell's hand slowed, bringing the music back to the melancholic flow of the opening theme. The intensity of the piece shifted, and Tyrell felt the release, the vulnerability of the quieter section wrapping around him like a cloak. The energy in the room had changed. The silence was no longer awkward or judgmental. It was reverent. Tyrell could feel the eyes on him, but instead of discomfort, he felt a sense of control. For the first time in his life, the power was his. He had taken the stage, claimed it, and played his heart out for everyone to hear. As he reached the final notes of the sonata, the sound lingered in the room like the final breath of someone who had given everything. Tyrell's fingers gently lifted from the keys, and the last note faded into the air. The silence was deafening. Tyrell's chest heaved with the effort. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his hands still tingled from the intensity of performance. His heart pounded in his chest, the adrenaline making him feel alive. But he didn't look at anyone. He didn't need to. He had done it. He had proved something, not to anyone else, but to himself. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the first sound came. It wasn't the applause Tyrell had been hoping for, not at first. Instead, It was the sound of Miss Lawrence's breath, a soft exhale that seemed to carry the weight of her disbelief. She blinked a few times, as though trying to process what had just happened. Her lips parted, and for a brief moment, she didn't speak. The room remained still, every eye fixed on Tyrell, as if waiting for him to move, to say something. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Miss Lawrence nodded. Well, her voice was softer than before, her usual sharpness replaced by something else, something like respect. That was unexpected. Tyrell's heart raced. Had she actually acknowledged his talent? The room was still silent, the shock hanging heavy in the air. But the silence didn't last long. The students, who had once looked down on him, began to stir. First, a few tentative claps from the back row. Then, slowly, more joined in. The applause grew, hesitant at first, then louder as the students recognized what they had just witnessed. Jenna, who had once been the loudest in her dismissal of him, was the first to stand up. Her hands clapped together, slowly at first, but with a growing sense of admiration. Tyrell looked at her, and for the first time, he saw something new in her expression: respect. Ms. Lawrence watched the scene unfold, her arms crossed tightly as if trying to keep her emotions in check. But the look in her eyes was unmistakable. She hadn't expected this. Tyrell had surpassed her expectations, shattered the image she had of him. Well done, Tyrell. Her voice was quieter now, without the cutting sarcasm that had once been so prominent. That was remarkable. Tyrell didn't know how to respond. He had been waiting for this moment, but now that it had come, words failed him. Instead, he just nodded, his chest still heavy with the weight of performance, still shaking with the realization of what he had just achieved. The room was no longer just a room full of skeptical students. It had become a place where he had earned his place. The applause, though still subdued, felt like a victory. Tyrell had stepped onto the stage and played his heart out, and in the process, he had earned something more valuable than applause. He had earned his own confidence. This was only the beginning. The room was still buzzing with the reverberations of Tyrell's performance, the applause fading as quickly as it had come. Tyrell sat at the piano, still catching his breath, the emotional weight of his performance settling deep within him. The students, who had been so quick to judge, were now offering tentative glances in his direction. Even Jenna, who had once been the loudest in her ridicule, was staring at him as though seeing him for the first time. Tyrell's eyes briefly flicked to Miss Lawrence, who was standing at the front of the room. She looked unsettled, her face pale, her mouth pressed into a tight line, as if trying to reconcile what she had just witnessed with the version of Tyrell she had expected. Her usual arrogance was gone, replaced by something softer, but still laced with the tension of a woman who had just been proven wrong in front of her students. She cleared her throat, attempting to regain her composure. Well, Tyrell, that was unexpected. Her words were slow, measured, as though she were carefully choosing each one. I must admit, you've certainly exceeded my expectations. Tyrell's heart swelled, but he could hear the undercurrent of condescension in her tone. There was no real warmth behind her words, only grudging recognition. It wasn't the praise he had hoped for, but it didn't matter. He had already achieved what he set out to do. He had proven his worth in front of everyone, including her. Her eyes flicked to the other students, and for a brief moment, Tyrell could almost hear her thoughts. What will they think if I praise him too much? It was all too clear that Miss Lawrence didn't know how to handle someone like Tyrell, someone who didn't fit the mold she had carefully crafted for her class. Tyrell gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He wasn't about to let her discomfort take away from the triumph he felt in his chest. Her praise meant little. He'd earned his place. Thank you, Miss Lawrence. His voice was steady, even though his hand still trembled slightly from the intensity of his performance. His words were polite, but the meaning behind them was clear. He didn't need her approval to feel good about himself. There was a pause, a brief but heavy silence before Miss Lawrence, visibly flustered, moved on to the next student. Her attention shifted elsewhere, but Tyrell remained seated at the piano, taking a moment to center himself. He had done it. As Tyrell sat, lost in the feeling of accomplishment, a soft voice cut through the quiet. "Hey, Tyrell." It was Jenna, standing awkwardly at the edge of the room, her hands fidgeting with the hem of her designer sweater. The sharp, confident arrogance that had always defined her was gone. In its place was something uncomfortably close to remorse. Tyrell's brow furrowed as he turned to her. He had barely had time to process the change in the atmosphere before Jenna spoke again. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. She shifted on her feet, clearly uncomfortable with the vulnerability she was showing. I didn't mean to make fun of you before. It was wrong, and Tyrell held up a hand, cutting her off before she could continue. He could see the guilt in her eyes, the uncertainty in her voice. He knew what she was trying to do. Try to redeem herself. Try to regain some of the power she had lost in the wake of his performance. But he wasn't interested in her apology. He didn't need it. It's fine, Jenna, Tyrell said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. His gaze shifted away from her, focusing instead on the piano keys in front of him. But I'm not interested. The words were blunt, and he didn't look at her as he said them. Jenna's face faltered for a moment, the apology hanging in the air between them. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her head slightly lowered. Tyrell didn't look back. He had already moved past it. The next few days in class were a strange mix of awkwardness and reluctant admiration. The students who had once dismissed Tyrell now seemed to approach him with caution, their eyes lingering on him as if they were seeing him for the first time. Whispers that had once been laced with mockery were now filled with respect. It was subtle at first. Small things, like Jenna giving him a half-hearted nod as she passed his desk, or the quiet murmur of students exchanging comments about his playing. There was no grand gesture, no parade of applause, but the change was undeniable. Tyrell had gone from being the outcast to the one people were trying to understand. Hey, man. Tyrell looked up to find one of the more popular students, Daniel, standing beside him after class. Daniel was someone who had never spared him a second thought, always too caught up in his own circle of friends. You really played that Beethoven piece. I didn't know you had it in you. Tyrell gave him a curt nod, not quite smiling, but acknowledging the shift. Thanks. There was no real warmth in his voice, but that didn't matter. He didn't need to be friends with Daniel. He just needed to be respected. Some students began to ask him questions about his practice, about how long it took to perfect certain pieces. They had a new respect for his dedication, for his passion, and yet Tyrell could sense the underlying reason for this newfound interest wasn't necessarily about genuine connection. It was more about curiosity, a desire to understand the boy who had stunned them all. And then there was Jenna, who, despite her apology, still kept her distance. She no longer mocked him openly, but Tyrell could see the discomfort in her eyes. He was okay with that. He didn't need her approval. As the days passed, something in Tyrell began to shift. The weight of his insecurity, the gnawing doubts about whether he truly belonged, began to lessen. His music had always been a source of solace, a way to channel his frustration and pain. But now, it was becoming something more. It was his shield. He no longer needed validation from the people who had doubted him. He had proven himself. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult practice session, Tyrell sat back and surveyed the classroom. He saw the students who had once looked at him with disdain now offering him glances of recognition. They were still divided, still trapped in their own little cliques. But now, Tyrell had something they didn't: respect. It wasn't easy to maintain his confidence. He was still very aware of the racial dynamics at play. He knew that some of his peers were only showing respect because they had been forced to acknowledge his talent. But it didn't matter. He wasn't playing for them anymore. He was playing for himself. I don't need them, he muttered to himself one day, as he prepared for another performance. I just need to keep going, keep playing, keep proving who I am. And so Tyrell did. With each note he played, his confidence grew. He began to understand that he was more than just a black kid in an elite school. He was an artist, a musician. He was Tyrell, and he would never let anyone take that away from him. Tyrell sat at the piano one afternoon, his fingers gliding over the keys in a steady rhythm. The classroom, which had once felt like an arena of judgment, now felt different. The The students who had once mocked him, including the popular kids and even some of the quiet ones, were now coming up to him after class, asking for advice on their own music projects. His playing had become the talk of the school. Whispers of his talent spread like wildfire, and it wasn't just confined to the music department anymore. "Hey, Tyrell, do you mind showing me how to get that transition smoother in my piece?" Daniel, one of the guys who had always ignored him, stood at his side, holding a sheet of music. Tyrell raised an eyebrow, but this time he didn't feel the sting of disbelief. "Sure, it's all about finding the right tempo. If you rush the notes, it won't sound as clean." He spoke with a quiet confidence, and for the first time, he felt like his words were valued. Even Jenna, who had once made his life miserable, now approached him hesitantly, her gaze more respectful. "I've been practicing this piece for weeks, but it's not coming out right." She looked down at the sheet music she held, reluctant to meet his eyes. "Try focusing on the phrasing. You're hitting the notes, but they don't feel connected." He offered his advice, his voice calm and free from bitterness. Jenna nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment, but Tyrell could see the spark of admiration in her eyes. By the end of the week, Tyrell's piano playing had become a common topic of conversation around school. Even the principal, Mrs. Martin, stopped him in the hallway one afternoon. "Tyrell, I just wanted to say that I've heard so much about your recent performance in class." "Well done." Her words were sincere, and she gave him a warm smile. "You've certainly made an impression." Tyrell smiled back, grateful for the recognition, but no longer feeling the need to seek approval. "Thank you, Mrs. Martin. I'm just doing what I love." The teachers who had once overlooked him now sought him out for advice as well. In the staff lounge, whispers of his talent became more frequent, and some began to suggest that perhaps his musical abilities could be showcased at the upcoming school recital. Tyrell's reputation had shifted from being the quiet, overlooked kid to someone whose skill demanded respect. But despite the new respect he'd earned, there was one person who remained noticeably absent from the newfound admiration, Ms. Lawrence. It didn't take long for the administration to catch wind of what had transpired. Some of the teachers had started talking behind closed doors, and soon enough, the rumors reached the ears of the parents. A few outspoken mothers and fathers had expressed their concerns about how Ms. Lawrence had treated Tyrell, questioning whether it was appropriate for a teacher to behave so dismissively toward a student based on their background. "You can't treat students that way, especially not a young black boy with such clear talent," one of the parents had said at a recent school board meeting, her voice laced with frustration. "That teacher needs to be held accountable." There were murmurs of discontent, and within a few days, Tyrell found himself called into the principal's office. Mrs. Martin, her face serious but warm, looked up from a folder as he entered. "Tyrell, we've been discussing some important matters regarding your music class." She began, her tone calm. "I want to assure you that the school takes all incidents like this seriously." Tyrell sat down, unsure of what exactly was happening. Was this about his performance, or was it something else? "Several parents have come forward with complaints about Ms. Lawrence's treatment of you in class. They've expressed concern over her behavior, and we decided to conduct an internal review." Mrs. Martin continued, her eyes studying him carefully. Tyrell's heart raced. He hadn't expected this. He had just wanted to play his music, not become involved in any drama. But now, as the principal spoke, he realized the impact his performance had made, not just on his classmates, but on the system that had long overlooked his worth. "We will be addressing the situation with Ms. Lawrence, and there will be consequences for her actions." Mrs. Martin's voice softened. "We want to ensure that this school remains a place where all students feel valued, regardless of their background." The conversation left Tyrell feeling conflicted. On one hand, he was relieved to know that someone had taken his side, but on the other, he couldn't shake the feeling that it had all gone too far. He wasn't looking for someone's job. He just wanted respect. But the wheels of change were already in motion, and there was no turning back now. Tyrell sat alone in the music room later that week, his fingers brushing over the piano keys absent-mindedly. The weight of everything that had happened over the past few weeks was beginning to settle in. He thought about the way things had unfolded, how his initial fear of judgment had been replaced by a quiet confidence. His performance, his talent, had spoken for him in ways words never could. He knew the road ahead wouldn't always be easy. There would always be hurdles to overcome, biases to confront, and obstacles that seemed insurmountable. But one thing was certain. His music would always be his voice, his shield, and his greatest weapon against the world's injustices. "I did it," he whispered to himself, the words tasting sweet. He wasn't just playing for anyone else anymore. He was playing for himself. And he would never stop. When he left the music room that day, Tyrell felt the weight of his journey settling in. He didn't need to seek validation from those who had doubted him. The moment he stepped on that stage, his music had already proven who he was. And though Ms. Lawrence might have tried to diminish his talent, he knew one thing for sure. His music would always speak louder than her prejudice. Tyrell's journey, though marked by moments of discomfort and frustration, culminated in a triumph not just over his teacher's prejudice, but over the oppressive expectations that had sought to define him. His story was not just one of musical brilliance. It was a testament to the power of self-belief and the transformative force of perseverance. After the events of the past few weeks, Tyrell had become more than just a quiet, overlooked student. He had become an example to others, particularly to those who had been overlooked or silenced. His performance had inspired a ripple effect throughout the school, one that challenged the very foundations of bias and discrimination. As the weeks passed, students who had once kept their heads down now found themselves speaking up, sharing their talents, and refusing to hide behind shadows of judgment. Tyrell had shown them that their voices mattered, and that their talents were not just something to be appreciated. They were a force to be reckoned with. One afternoon, as Tyrell sat in the courtyard during lunch, a quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. He looked up to see Maria, a girl from his class who had always kept to herself, standing near him. "Tyrell, I just wanted to say what you did in music class. That was amazing." Her voice was small, but there was a determination in her eyes. "You made me realize that I don't have to hide my voice anymore. I've always loved singing, but I was too scared. Now, I think I'm going to try out for the choir." Tyrell smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "You should, Maria. You got something special. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He leaned back, the satisfaction of knowing he had made a difference settling into his chest. Maria nodded, and for the first time, Tyrell saw her stand a little taller, her shoulders back, her chin raised. It wasn't just about the applause. It was about finding strength in who you truly were. As the bell rang, signaling the end of lunch, Tyrell stood up, feeling the weight of everything he had achieved. His talent had broken through more than just a musical barrier. It had shattered the walls of judgment that had held him back for so long. And in doing so, he had created space for others to rise with him. Tyrell had learned something invaluable. When you stay true to your passion and yourself, no bias or barrier is strong enough to keep you from reaching your full potential. His journey was a reminder to everyone that talent, perseverance, and self-confidence could and would break through even the most rigid of biases.